Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time Scarlet Woman, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss mysticism, magic, religion, spirituality, and the occult. And in this video, we're going to be giving a much-needed video and something I've been thinking about doing for a while, and that is a reading guide for Thelema. I'm a practicing thelemite and ceremonial practitioner, and I find that when people get interested in Thelema, they really feel lost on where to read first. A lot of people will pick up the Book of the Law by Crowley because it is sort of like the most famous thelemic text, and they'll read it and they'll be, to put it bluntly, they're confused, right? They read it, it's a book that's written in like a really complex esoteric cipher, and they get really confused and they put it down and they go, no, Thelema isn't for me. So I wanted to create a guide so that doesn't happen. I remember when I first read the Book of the Law, I was beyond lost. The Book of the Law is something you need to read so many times to fully grasp all the nuance of it. And even then, I feel like there's still some things that I will probably understand later on as I go further and further down the Thalemic path. So I wanted to make this video for the absolute beginners or those who are a little experienced. So I wanted to make this video for anyone who's looking into Thelema. I'm going to be going through books by Crowley, books that you should read if you're an absolute beginner and you know nothing about occultism, books to read that are after Crowley, because Thelema is not just Crowleyism, right? We're not just Crowleyites, we're thelemites. There's a distinction there, and that is an important distinction. So I wanted to make a video for anyone who's getting into Thelema, whether you're an absolute beginner or an esoteric expert, so you know where to start, where to jump in. I'm going to recommend certain books as jumping off points for different people. I'm going to give summaries of a wide variety of things, and I'm going to sort of go from Crowley to present. Before I get into Crowley, I want to make the section called Felima for the absolute beginner. If you know nothing about occultism and nothing about Thelema, I really suggest watching my What is Thelema video first, but since you clicked on this, I'm going to assume you have a little bit of a working definition of Thelema. If not, Thelema is a mysticism system, religion, and philosophy that was originally started by Aleister Crowley in the early 1900s that synthesizes a lot of different esoteric practices and has a distinct philosophical bent. So that's the like 2-second summary, but I really suggest watching my What is Thelema video. But first, if you're absolutely new, maybe you found Felima through pop culture or music, like maybe you're a really big Ozzy Osbourne's fan, maybe you listened to the last podcast on the Left series, or anything that sort of like brings people who are absolutely new with no esoteric experience to Thelema. These are sort of where I think you should start. Or conversely, if you're someone who has an experience in like an Eastern practice, or a practice that's very, very different from Western esotericism, or if you're like really into witchcraft and you don't really have that background on let's say you don't really know what Golden Dawn is, you don't really know what the LBRP is, you don't really know what like Hermeticism is, so you're gonna wanna start as from like the absolute beginner perspective. The first thing I'm gonna recommend is Fresh Fear from the Skies by IO131. This is a brick of a book, it's massive, and it's a very, very beginner-friendly book. IO131 he makes a lot of beginner content. He runs the website Thelemic Union. And this book is great for the absolute beginner because it explains the philosophy of Thelema. It gives you rituals, it explains holidays, and it kind of gives you a map from step 1 to being an experienced practitioner of how to sort of begin with the Thelemic current. It's super digestible, super beginner friendly, and it's great for the absolute beginner. As well, there's a book called Living Thelema, which is sort of the adaptation of the Living Thelema podcast by David Shoemaker, that is great for the absolute beginner. It goes through core ideas like the HGA, rituals, philosophy, a little bit of history, in a very quick, digestible manner. Each chapter is pretty short, and so it gives like a short overview, as well as this book is a lot shorter than Fresh Fear from the Skies, if you want to start with something a little shorter. As well, if you're moving into Thelema for another practice, this would be a really good place to start. My next would be, once you sort of read one of these like beginner 101 What is Thelema books, to check out books by Lon Milo Duquette. Lon Milo Duquette is prolific. He has so many books. Oh my God, so many, and they're all great. He has, if you like my sort of humor that I put in my content, you'd probably really like Lon Milo Duquette. I've had people tell me that my content kind of reminds me of him. His books are really good if you're new. I still read Duquette. I find whenever so what I do is I pick up a Duquette book whenever I want to go into a new topic in Felima. Like let's say I understand some of the philosophy, I understand Crowley's life, but I want to get sort of an understanding of, let's say, Enochian, right? He has a book on Enochian that's really great called Enochian Vintage Magic, right? So I'll start there, and then after that jump into like deeper things like Dee's journals and Dee's writings. So Duquette is great when you want to start a new topic in Felima. His books are very modern, his books are very relatable, as well as if you're not a Thelemite and you're looking into ceremonial magic concepts, his books are great. Like Chicken Kabbalah gets recommended so heavily and so constantly for a reason. So if you want those like beginner into these new topics, Duquette is fantastic. My next would be for people who are really interested in the ritual stuff, who are brand new and are like, let's say you're interested in Thelema not because you've read about Crowley's life, not because you're interested in kind of the like ideas of like do what thou wilt and that very kind of freedom, liberty-oriented philosophy side of Thelema, but you're really interested in rituals. I would really suggest Llewellyn's Complete Book of Ceremonial Magic. It covers, like in a short chapter, every sort of major school of modern ceremonial magic, and the Thelema chapter is really great. The Thelema chapter focuses so heavily on the rituals that if you're someone who's really into ritualism or like sort of the magic side of things, it's a great place to jump off and enter. So those are going to be my absolute beginner books. That's sort of like, let's say you don't know anything about the occult or you are just starting a new topic. Those are where I would start. So now let's say you know a little bit about the occult, you have a little bit of experience, and you want to jump into Thelema after having a background, right? So let's say you're someone who's been practicing for about 2-ish years. You really understand like the tree of life, you understand what an HGA is, you understand like Crowley's basic ideas, you have an outline of what his life was like, and you want to get into Thelema now. So at that point, I am going to recommend to start with Crowley. A lot of the times I don't recommend people start with Aleister Crowley because his writing is it's tricky, right? So if you're new to esoterica and you pick up a copy of like the Book of the Law or the Book of Lies, you're probably going to be very stumped and very lost. So when you read Crowley, you're going to want to have a little bit of a background. Even his very famous texts like Magic and Theory and Practice, there's still something that you need a lot of cross-referencing to. A thing you see in a lot of Crowley's writings is he'll reference himself, so you're going to want to pick up more of his books to understand it. But as well, I want to point out, when I talk about Crowley's writing, his work is out of copyright, so websites like Hermetic Library have almost his entire book releases and it's legal. So I would really suggest, to save money, really checking out websites like the Hermetic Library. They're a great organization. They're sort of like the Safari of Felima. They can cover you so you don't sort of spend a lot of money on Crowley's works trying to follow his footnotes and references. So my first Crowley book that I recommend to people, there are two that I tend to recommend. And the first is for people who are interested in the ritual magic stuff. And that would be Magic Without Tears. Magic Without Tears is sort of a book where Crowley's talking to his students and sending letters back and forth. And it's basically his book where he explains his concepts most plainly and simply. It's the most clear-cut, it's the most easy to understand, it's the most easy to read. The format's a little weird because it's written in letters, so that can kind of trip people up. But for like the absolute Crowley beginner who's interested in the like metaphysics, ritual stuff, perfect point to start. If you're not interested in like the metaphysics, ritual stuff as much, and you're more interested in the philosophy, or let's say the Book of the Law, I would really recommend the book The Law is for All. The Law is for All is kind of hard to find a physical copy of, or at least I've had a hard experience finding one. But The Law is for All summarizes his philosophical points really well. He sort of explains the Book of the Law, which it's hard to find someone explaining the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law is confusing. So if you want to read the Book of the Law early on, let's say you're really ambitious, you're not going to listen to my warning that it's going to confuse you, I would read it side by side with his book, The Law is for All. It's really great and it sort of makes everything a little clearer and make a little bit more sense. My next recommendation is going to be Magic in Theory and Practice. Once you've got your Magic Without Tears, you've got a little bit of understanding of Crowley's systems, I would recommend Magic in Theory and Practice. Magic in Theory and Practice is his book where he explains his system and runs you through everything. From ritual formulas, the tools used, evocations, Babylon, and so many more, Magic in Theory and Practice is the core text that people tend to recommend when they talk about Thalemic magic. However, Magic in Theory and Practice is rather confusing. There's a lot of references to other text, and it takes a lot of like rereading the same page again and again to get it. But let's say you have that background, you've read a little bit, you understand a little bit about the system. This is a great place to jump into, and this would be a good point to jump into this. Just know that it is going to be a kind of hard read. I really recommend like cross-referencing. If something like, let's say the LVX formula confuses you, look up blog posts, look it up. Like there's no shame in asking questions on Reddit or Discord servers. There's so many Thelemites who can help you, as well as you can find a lot of lodges do like reading groups for it. And you can find a lot of blog posts explaining it. I find that Gerald Del Campo has some cool stuff on Hermetic Library that can kind of like, because his stuff's very like Thelema for the people, so his stuff is really good to reference here. But yeah, so just don't give yourself a hard time if you kind of struggle with it. It's hard, it's one where you're gonna have to reread a bit, but once you get it, it does teach the Thalemic system of mysticism so clearly and well, and you can really understand where Thelema deviates from these other systems. Next recommendation, talking about referencing, is Liber 777. Liber 777 is Crowley's attempt to make a massive correspondence chart that corresponds like every mysticism system to each other. So Liber 777 is not really something you sit and read, but reference. So once you're starting to get into these deeper Thalemic esoterica pieces, you're gonna really want that as a reference book. It's very similar to, say, like the Llewellyn's Complete Book of Correspondences. The layout of Liber 777 is a little confusing. It has a little bit of a learning curve to it. But once you get it, it makes a lot of sense, and it's really good for reference. There's no need to memorize it. I've seen people make like flashcards and stuff for Liber 7777, but the book is there for a reason. You have it on your desk for a reason. It's mostly like a reference book. My next is going to be, after you've read these, to read The Vision and the Voice. The Vision and the Voice is Crowley's sort of experience surfing the Enochian aethers, and this is where Babylon originates from. So Vision and the Voice is one, once you have to have these fundamentals down, right? And you also should have an understanding of Enochian. So I would really suggest reading, there's one book that's been published that's like a collection of Crowley's Enochian teachings called like Enochian Magic by Aleister Crowley. You can find it in like every Barnes & Noble. It's one of the most like circulated books currently in the Felima sphere for some reason. So I would recommend like getting a little bit of background on Enochian, maybe go back to Duquette and check out Enochian Vision Magic, or do just some Googling. But yeah, so Vision and the Voice is kind of like, I heard someone once compare it to the Talmud of Thelema, which I found really cool, because a lot of Thelemic ideas sort of originates from this, and you see a lot of references to things like the aethers in Thelemic practice. So I really recommend reading Vision of the Voice. Don't read it first, make sure you've read some of this stuff ahead of it, but once you've made it through that, Vision of the Voice you can learn so much from. There are people who teach full-on classes on the Vision and the Voice. I'd really like to make a video on it at some point if you guys would be interested in that. I think it's one of the most essential Thelemic texts and doesn't get brought up as much as it should. And after this point, then I'm gonna say read the Book of the Law and the Book of Lies. Read the Book of the Law first. The Book of the Law is considered like the holy text of Thelema largely. There are a few things that get classified as what we call holy text. They're also called like Class A writings. So read the Book of the Law now. I really think you need context before you read it, because otherwise it's just a puzzle, right? Because once you have this information, you can start sort of solving the puzzle and making sense of it, but just don't read it first. I think that that's a big mistake people make. So once you have this background, then read it. It's really short, it's like 40 pages. And then after that, you can look at the Book of the Lies. The Book of Lies is meant to be a handbook for people as they cross the abyss, which is a thing that happens very late on in Thelemic mysticism. And the Book of the Lies will make sense to you at that point. Before then, it starts making sense with time, but there's a lot of keys to Thelemic mysteries inside of the Book of Lies. Now let's discuss the Equinox. The Equinox, I've pulled it up in a lot of videos and it comes up a lot. The Equinox is the publication of Crowley's group, the AA, and all the AA rituals are inside the Equinox. The Equinox is massive. There are tons of volumes of it. It's thousands upon thousands of pages, but you don't need to read all of it. A lot of it, like you see poems in there, there are plays in there, there's a lot of sort of filler. So I really recommend checking out, so Lon Milo Duquette went to the time to make books called The Best of the Equinox, and they're divided into sections. Like he has one for dramatic ritual, he has one for sex magic, he has one for a lot of other things. They're divided into like sections. So I really recommend checking out Lon Milo Duquette's Best of the Equinox series. It's also on Scribd if you have a Scribd subscription, and then you can see like the highlights, as well as you can go on places like Illuminous Archive or Hermetic Library and flip through them. Getting a full set of the Equinox is insanely expensive. I don't own a full set. But you can find like highlight sections. You don't need to read everything, just read the rituals and read sort of essential written portions. You can skip over things like plays or song lyrics and all the kind of filler things, because it was meant to be like a magazine for the order, so it's not just like an educational Thelemic text all the way through. And with this is the end of my Crowley section. These are what I would call the essential Thelemic texts that I see referenced the most and I see come up the most. Beyond this, Crowley wrote a lot more. Crowley was prolific. And if I went through every single book Crowley ever wrote, oh my God, we'd be here for hours. We'd have to go through his plays, his poems, his novels, all his rituals. I don't have time for that, and neither do you. But you should not try to read everything he ever wrote. It's not all necessary, right? Like there's certain things like the Absinthe Poetry, White Stains, Moonchild, Diary of a Drug Fiend, etc., etc., etc. But they're not essential Thelemic esoteric literature, and if you're here, I'm assuming that's why you're here. Once you get through these essential texts, and if you want to read more, then get into all of that. And I'm assuming once you've read all this, you'll know what you want to read, and you'll see kind of like like the further things to explore. But this is what I would say the essential texts are. But if you want to read more Crowley, do it. I've read more Crowley than this. His work is fascinating. Wiser Books released a guide to Crowley's, it's like a short little like 20-page guide that has context of things Crowley references, and it's like a little reading guide to have side by side while you're reading Crowley that's super helpful, as well as I'm gonna botch this pronunciation, Richard Koskensky. I'm news with him on Twitter. I'll put his stuff up here. I really don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm so sorry if you're watching this. He has a book on the history of Crowley's life that's super helpful. His book is like 800 pages, and it is the essential Crowley biography if you want to know the history of his life. Because with Crowley, you do want some of that context. Some of his religious upbringing and stuff really color his writing and how it's sort of understood. So I really suggest checking out his biography at some point. Now let's get into post-Crowley Thelema. I think there's a big misconception that Crowley is all Thelema is. We're all Crowleyites. We all worship Crowley. But in reality, after him, a lot happened. And so let's talk about sort of one of the biggest schools of post-Crowley Thelema. Not post-Thelema, but post-Crowley. You know what I'm saying. And that would be Typhonian Thelema. So Kenneth Grant was one of Crowley's students, and he started a sort of paradigm of them called Typhonian Thelema. Typhonian Thelema is a pretty big deviation, and he ended up starting his own order called the Typhonian Order. They're still around, and if you want to read Kenneth Grant, buckle in. It's even harder than Crowley. Kenneth Grant is really hard to understand. It's a lot of reading. But when you read Kenneth Grant, you're gonna just want to jump in sort of in the deep end. There's no real Lon Milo DuQuette style books for Typhonian Thelema. If there is, please let me know, but to my knowledge, there is not. So you're gonna want to start with the Typhonian trilogies. The first one, The Magical Revival, will give context on Crowley and sort of the background, and then forward from there, it explores the Typhonian system. The Typhonian system is really interesting and has a big overlap with ideas like, because I did a video on sabbatic witchcraft, cultist Sabbati was really influenced by Typhonian Thelema, as well as, I talked about chaos magic a bit. Austin Osman Spare, who's basically the grandfather of chaos magic, was really influenced by Grant, and you see a lot of exchange of ideas between the systems. But for Kenneth Grant, you need to just read the Typhonian trilogies, you need to buckle in, you need to be willing to have your copy of Liber 777 right by your side, and just kind of embrace the weirdness. It's hard to approach, but you kind of just have to go into the water. Next would be Parsonite. So Jack Parsons, I have a video on Jack Parsons. I don't really know exactly what to call this deviation. You could call it the witchcraft, but that only really applies when we're talking about what happened at the very end of his life. So I'm just gonna call it Parsonite Thelema. That's a term now, apparently. I'm gonna make it a term. For him, you're gonna wanna start with Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword is his big essay that gets referenced the most. It's where he defines the witchcraft, he talks about Babylon, he gives his political takes. I really recommend it. It's like 20 pages long. If you want an understanding of like the context of Jack Parsons' work, Manon Hindenburg White has an essay in the book The Eloquent Blood, which is a collection of essays by various Thelemites and Babylon-related practitioners that will give context on Parsons' life and his work, so you can sort of have a bit of an understanding before you jump into it. But yeah, you're just going to go in cold, and then you're going to want to check out Liber 49 and the Book of the Antichrist. These are from his rituals and his experiences, and this is where you can really see his system form. So you're going to want to read those after you've read his Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. Sadly, a lot of his writings were lost or destroyed, so we're missing a lot of information, which is tragic. But with those alone, you can get a lot of sort of a sense of what he was going for. And then after this, let's talk about modern Thelema, progressive, which modern Thelema, okay, so we've seen two terms emerge, and that would be progressive Thelema and post-Thelema. I can make a video on these two things, but in Scarlet Imprint's website, they've used the term progressive Thelema, and then in a new sort of sect that broke off about a month ago, we see post-Thelema. So I'm just gonna lump them into a category, and that's gonna be modern Thelemic writings. First thing I'm gonna recommend is Apocalyptic Witchcraft. Apocalyptic Witchcraft is a book by Peter Gray, and it explores a lot of the Parsonite concepts. You see a lot of references to things like the cultist Sabbati, to Jack Parsons, to Babylon, and it's sort of a manifesto. It sort of explores the core of witchcraft, right? Like, it's not really like an educational book. It doesn't give you step-by-step ritual instruction, but it sort of has this evocative feeling to it that gives a sense of what's happening, and it's like a powerful esoteric ritual in a book form. It's really cool. Then I'm gonna recommend The Eloquent Blood by Manon Hindenburg White. Manon Hindenburg White is an academic in Amsterdam, and her book, The Eloquent Blood, is kind of expensive, but it's worth it. Explores Babylon across all of Thalemic history, from Revelations to Crowley to Kenneth Grant to Parsons. So by reading that book, you can actually get a sense of how Thelema evolved over the years and these sort of schools of thoughts I've mentioned. And as well, it talks about Thelema now. It talks about putting queer voices into the Thalemic community and sort of the future of Thelema in a very interesting way. And it's very woman-focused. In Thelema, Thelema has a pretty complex relationship to women. I want to make a video on that at some point, like Thalemic womanhood and like how Thelema interacts with things like, you know, feminism and women's rights and Babylon and all that. But it explores that in a really interesting way. And as well, talking about women's perspectives, there's a group called Templum Abyssi, and they have a bunch of essays on their website by a woman named Georgia Van Rout. I really admire her and their essays. They also have a few books now, and they are women's voices. You see LGBT inclusive rituals, you see the woman at the forefront. And it's a very new take on Thelema, and it's really cool. They're an emerging group, it's emerging sets of ideas, and those essays are really interesting. They've posed Thelema in a new feminist framework, and they explore it in a new way. So this has been my Thelema reading guide. I could have definitely added more. I could have added like influences that led to Thelema, but also I've already given like 30 book recommendations, and I'm not gonna put anything more on your plate. Once again, if you wanna save money on reading these titles, Hermetic Library is great, Sacred Text is great, as well as getting a Scribd subscription is super helpful, so you can afford all these titles. And you can find a lot of ways to get like used books or to money save and kind of do it in a more affordable way. But just, I hope this helps you. I hope this gives a guide for people who are new to Thelema, so they know where to start and they know sort of what to do when they really want to get inspired and jump into the Thelemic canon. If you want to support me, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Patreon. You can support this on Patreon, get extra videos and ritual guides. You can donate directly on Ko-Fi, and you can support my podcast, Occultism with a Side of Salt, on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon as well. And I also released jewelry. I'll pop a picture up here. You can buy this through the Winter Wolf Rituals website, or linked below. If you use the code Days of Writing, you will get a percentage off, because we are approaching the 3 days of writing in the Book of the Law, a very exciting Thelemic holiday. And so thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. If you're subscribed for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel. Bye.